Welcome to another episode of DD on the Spot. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Johnson. Before I get to our guests here today, I'd like to remind everyone that if you enjoy this content, to please give a like and subscribe down below. We greatly appreciate it. We have James Swan on the show for a very, very special episode here. He's an environmental psychology Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. He's talking a lot about the problems of crime on the wildlands, which is a very specific problem that I don't think many people really know about, and he's here to shed a little bit of light on the topic. James, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome, Ryan.
Absolutely. So why don't you give us a little bit of a backstory on what got you inspired into this topic?
Well, I've off and on since the 1970s, I've produced documentaries and worked in television. And, maybe, 10, 12 years ago, the California game wardens approached me and asked my son and I to produce a documentary about game wardens. And so most people think of game wardens, they think of people that check, for fish and then in deer season, they're out to make sure people don't poach. Well, the reality is that what we started doing is, first of all, I said, why? What do you want this documentary? And they said, well, California has 38 million people. We have 192 game wardens in the field. And there's at least $100 million a year in illegal wildlife trafficking going on in the state. We can't deal with it. We could do with a lot more game wardens. Well, okay. So that started out 2 years of riding along with game wardens on the ground, out in the woods, on snowmobiles, on boats, and then flying. The reality was that game wardens are a form of police officer, and you think of them as being only checking people for fish and wildlife and licenses. Well, guess what? Game wardens enforce all laws, not just wildlife law, but criminal law, civic law. They do search and rescues. So we started out and, you're in on these things. And then you realize that just about every person that they encounter either has a knife or a gun. Now think about that about police in cities. They don't encounter that many people that are armed like that. Well, for game wardens, everybody that they interact with, they work primarily alone in remote locations where you can't get a backup. I remember the first time that I went out with a warden, we were working the Sacramento River and driving along through the brush, and looking for fishermen. Well, all of a sudden, there's this car parked there. And the warden stops and he says, well, let me just check this. There shouldn't be a car parked here. It's not a good place to fish or anything. So he calls in the license number, and it's a stolen car. Okay, so he says, I'll tell you what, I've reported this, but it's going to take 45 minutes to have backup come to where I am.
Wow.
And I've got a truck. Most police officers do not have a truck with four-wheel drive, so they may not even have, an easy time getting here. I'm going to check this out. You see that trail? Okay, now, just to let you know, this is the radio and how it works. This is the shotgun, and this is my rifle. You can sit here in the car and wait for me, but if you come along with me, you're my backup. So suddenly I've changed, from being an observer to be an armed backup. So we walked in on this place, and you could smell the fire was still burning, and the guys had heard us and they fled. We never caught them, but it was like that was a rude awakening to what happens. Well, about 5 or 6 months later, one of the wardens approached me and he said, my detail specialty is trespass marijuana grows, and we're going on a raid. And he gave us the location, and it was down near Stanford University, where there's a big regional park down there. So my son and I drove down there to film this. We get there, and there's like National Guard, local police, sheriff, state people, and one DEA agent. There's a dozen people. And I thought, well, Jesus, this is not just, a game warden walking around in the woods. And he just said, follow us up into the hills. And when we got to this place and park, this is a big regional park with a lot of, growing up area. A National Guard helicopter flies in. So what happens then is that the wardens are all set up and they are carrying complete combat gear. Every warden has 2 pistols, one concealed, one open, and an AR. And so 2 of them climb onto this sling that hangs down under the helicopter. The helicopter takes off and flies off with these 2 guys 100 feet underneath on a line, lowers them down. Well, on one hand, it's quick for them to get into places, but on the other, you're a sitting duck out there if somebody wanted to shoot at you. Well, nobody shot at him. Call says, okay, it's clear for you to come in with a camera. So we climb into the helicopter and start flying over and come to a place. The helicopter goes down and goes down and goes down, and it gets close enough. The wash from the prop suddenly pushes aside the manzanita that was growing there. Here's this bright green crop that's about 5 or 6 feet, and there's black plastic piping all over the place. Suddenly, it's like what happens is trespass marijuana growers will take and cut out the understory in a forest, but they leave the trees in anything that's larger as a canopy, so it's hard to see from the air.
Yep.
Okay. So suddenly, here are all these wardens down there cutting stuff and all this bright green plants. And so we cart out, about, I don't know how many 100 plants that on that rope that they had been flying in on. And on the way back, we go cross over the road that's maybe a quarter of a mile there away. And the guy who's flying it, the National Guardsman, says, look over there. And I said, what? He said, look closely for the light green plants. Well, my God, he says, there's another grow on the other side of the road. So now we're within 5 miles of Stanford Stadium. Literally, you can see it in the distance. And in a long distance, you see the skyline of San Francisco. But this is a park, we're for wildlife and people on trails. Okay, so the morning goes along, and they took out 10,000 plants. We break for lunch, and then they said, we're going to go after across the road. This is going to be closer because it's only 100 yards off the road. So they do, again, sky riding over there. And after about 10 minutes, we get a call, says, okay, it's clear. Your warden friend, Lieutenant Norris, is going to meet you at the road to guide you in. So we drive over and park, and John comes out. He says, here's the trail. It doesn't look like much, almost like a rabbit runway, but if we follow it when you get in there, you're going to be really surprised. And he says, oh, by the way, I want you to step exactly where I step on every place, because they put out tripwires attached to shotguns, and they have bungee pits with those sharp stakes in them. So we get in there okay, and it's the same deal. It's like there's manzanita that's about 15 to 20 feet high, and here are 5 to 6 feet tall marijuana plants. Each one has its own little drip irrigation system, and they're just piping all over. So he takes me into the camp, and we film this. And you see everything is spray painted, and there's, cots for people, tents, garbage, whatever. And I basically said, well, now, how are you going? Where does this piping go? We're up on top of a hill. He says, well, look at over here. And here are half a dozen 55-gallon drums. They're all painted. And where did the water come from? Well, he says, here's the trail there. It leads off to a housing division of Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs. And at night, what these guys were doing is they would sneak over and steal 5-gallon pails worth of water from their irrigation systems around the houses. And so the sprinkler systems. So another 10,000 plants. Okay, so we've got 20,000 plants for the day. You can see ammunition laying around. Almost all of these, the growers are armed. And so, suddenly, I mean, we're looking at probably $10 million worth of marijuana. Okay?
Yeah. That's a lot of money.
And, we went along afterwards on some raids where wardens sometimes will work covertly, where they will dress up and act out like characters. We went on one that was in Pacific Heights, right in the sort of the heart of the most wealthy area in San Francisco. And the lead warden on this case was a covert guy. And what we were looking at is that they had uncovered a smuggling ring of caviar from sturgeon up in the Sacramento River. Street gangs were catching the fish and then selling them to the Russian mafia.
Oh.
So the lead warden's costume is to look like a surfer. And he goes up there to the door of this. It's an exclusive apartment complex, and the search warrant wasn't to get in the first door, which was locked, but it was to get into the apartment of the guy who was the landlord, and then also down into the garages underneath. Okay, so we're looking at how does he get in? Well, we were across the street with a telephoto lens when he's talking, and his character is, oh man, I got a hot date tonight, and we got to have caviar, please, please sell some to me. He talked his way in and got the door open. And as soon as that come in, we've got 8 game wardens coming in, and they busted the guy. Okay. And then they went downstairs, and there were 8 different refrigerators there and $10,000 worth of caviar.
Wow.
Okay. So those kinds of experiences, we filmed the whole thing. And then what basically happened is that I'm also a TV producer and actor sometimes. And I got together with some friends down in LA to try and talk about how to get a better positive shows for fishermen and hunters and all outdoor recreationists. We don't see many of them except when they're in danger or they're crooks. Gave it to Original Productions, and it took us a year and a half to get the thing all approved and everything, but that's what led to Wild Justice. And so, in the process of doing this, we were exposed to all kinds of different things. And my son and I were one of the field units in it. I was a co-executive producer for the series. And after the first year or so, we targeted only special things, and I had more time to work. And so I started doing a survey of other game wardens around the country. Just how, is California really this unique? And I talked to wardens from all 50 states, wow. And they started telling me more stories. And it was just like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, all these things, that were going on. And so what happened, of course, with Wild Justice is that it came on and it pulled in over 3 million viewers. It was the biggest documentary reality series on National Geographic. And so everybody's out now trying to get, all these other states. And there's at least 8 other game wardens, shows now as a result. And so we lasted 3 years in California with this. But, in the process, when you start really, I started working with a game warden, John Norris, the fellow who took me into the first grow, and to focus on this. And we ended up writing a book, and I'll promote it just for a second. Okay, here it is. It's called War in the Woods. And it's the story of what John's whole team was doing, going after these grows. And they had situations where one warden was shot and almost killed by going in there. And then, you run into these growers, and they're all armed. And so what then happened is that the book got out, and it's now been optioned for a scripted dramatic television series called Lone Pine, which they're going to start shooting in the springtime. And in the meanwhile, what happened with John is that from the book, he got enough publicity together so that he was able to form a tactical unit of game wardens. Now, these guys are all trained like Navy SEALs, and their specialty is to go in on these grows. And so, John's got a new book coming out called Hidden War, which deals with a second version of it. But what I ended up doing in the process, so we did the first book, and then I started doing more research. Now, I live in New Mexico these days, and I begin to ask the question, well, what's it really like here? Well, then, the wardens here took me out, and suddenly, I'm encountering stuff that was kind of just like out of a movie. Mm-hmm. I mean, marijuana growers, meth labs. There are people out there, squatters, who just take over land for people. I met this guy who is an expert on Army and military PTSD. And he said between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, there are at least 1,000 veterans who are living out in the bush, and they do not want to have a lot of contact. Wow. On top of it, we have homeless people who drive their cars around and just set them up. Occasionally, they will just plunk down on somebody's land, and they're squatters, and they try to own it. You remember that just recently, they busted that one thing in northern New Mexico that turned out to be terrorists, okay? And so, and I was introduced to feral dogs, and they're scary as hell. Yeah. You couldn't really go for a walk out there unless you were armed. Mm-hmm. So, and I know two people who were almost killed by feral dogs. Wow. Well, I don't live out in the country anymore. Yeah. I live in nice in Rio Rancho, which is a wonderful suburb of Albuquerque. But I just started really looking into this stuff, I mean, in addition to the television stuff and whatever, I really wanted to say, well, what really is going on? Well, I had some very nice conversations with the Forest Service. Right now, we think of, in California, by the way, as a result of Wild Justice and the documentary, there are now 360 game wardens in the field. So it's doubled as a result of our publicity. So I feel very happy that happened. And they could use probably twice that many. Yeah. But trespass marijuana grows. Right now, they have been found in 22 states, in 72 national forests. There are some of the major places include Colorado, Oregon, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Kentucky. These grow sites are 1,000 plants or more per site, up to over 100,000 plants. All the guys are armed. And just some statistics from John. 85% of the trespass growers that John's special unit arrests are illegal. And they get an average of 2 years as a sentence for doing what they're doing, then they're deported. But just listen to over a 4-year period, John's unit, this is what they've done. They've eradicated 2.1 million marijuana plants that are grown with toxic chemicals. So the stuff that's being sold is poisonous. Arrested 745 armed felons, confiscated 433 illegal firearms, removed 335 tons of grower waste, and they've also removed 41 tons of illegal fertilizers, toxic poisons, and pesticides.
Wow.
And 614 dams that were consuming at about 750 million gallons of water during California's drought period.
That's unbelievable.
And one of the most successful members of the unit is their dog, Phoebe. In those 4 years, Phoebe ran down and did 114 bite arrests on people and assisted on 740 other people. So, what I'm getting at here is that, I mean, I've got all the stats, but I can tell you that this one area opened up the doors on that. But then you start to ask the question, well, okay, what else is happening? All right. And some interesting things have been going on over the last few years. For example, since 1990, there's almost 13 million more homes have been, and with 25 or more million people are now moved to wildland urban interface. Okay. And there are at least a million more people out there with RVs who are living out of them. And then you start to add in, you know, homeless people. And in Oregon, there's so many that they've actually set up camps out in the forest. There's a great new movie that's just come up, Leave No Trace. I recommend it. If you want to see what I'm talking about or whatever, it's for real. That's what's really happening out there. So what you end up with is there's this migration of people, including criminals, that have been moving out into wildlands areas. At the same time, nationwide, there are 7,000 game wardens total. Okay. What that ends up meaning is that's as many game wardens for the whole United States as New York Police Department puts out for New Year's Eve. Okay. So, but the other stats are that BLM, Bureau of Land Management, manages more acreage than any other law enforcement officer. There's only 300 officers for the whole United States. Wow. Army Corps of Engineers that deals with the dams and water resources, there are only 1,500 rangers, and most of them are not even armed. And what has happened is that, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has special agents that go around and doing covert work like game wardens. There are only 250 of them for the whole United States. There are more whooping cranes now than there are special agents. So what you've got is the assault rates on people on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have increased by 40%, and in national parks by 12%. Right now, the FBI says game wardens are 7 times as likely to be assaulted as an urban police officer.
Jeez. That is, I mean, all these stats are just so unbelievable. But I got to ask, like, what the problem in California, a lot of people don't realize that with California specifically, 90 to 95% of the population is in those major cities. What you got, like San Francisco, LA.
Yeah.
So is the problem more in maybe like the northern area of California, or is that where you travel? Because that's like a huge forested area. Most people don't realize that that's a lot of forest up in the northern part. That's where all those fires start. But is that where you say the main part of the problem is?
The main part of the problem in California is along the Sierras with national forests and national parks. But then when you get up north in what's called the Emerald Triangle, which is Mendocino County, Trinity County, and Humboldt County, that's where it really, really is so strong. Now, this is the area where it was logging and forestry that was primarily running the place up until maybe 1970. And then the hippies all moved up there for the Back to Nature movement. And they brought along some weed to grow. Okay, no big million plant grows or anything, but it was cool to hang out there, and actually after a while, the county commissions welcomed them. They said, oh, cool, hang out there and just don't start any fires. And, and they were growing their little grows and they'd sell some marijuana and whatever. And they actually protected them and passed ordinances that they allowed recreational marijuana up there. About 1990, it began to change as it was discovered by people from organized crime. And it's not, it's Hispanics, Russians, Asians, and some gangs. And they moved into the woods up there. You can almost grow marijuana at least 10 months of the year in that area. There's enough rainfall, and the fog moderates the temperatures, especially along the coast. And so what you end up with is these guys kick the hippies out of the woods. And they started coming in, and they were not messing around with just, a few plants, 1,000 plants or more. And they're living out into the woods. It's armed. And I mean, I've got photos of all kinds of stuff that you could see out there. And with it, they would bring along and changing the whole atmosphere of the community to the point where I interviewed 15 different people who lived up there who used to love to hike out in the woods, and 10 of them had been shot at.
Wow.
And so, and so what has happened is, and then talking with the wardens and everybody up there, I mean, they're working probably 10 to 11 months of the year right now. Yes, California has legalized marijuana, first for medicinal and then for recreational. But less than 10% of all the growers have got licenses. And the really big grows tend to be illegals. About 80%, according to the wardens, about 80% of all the marijuana grown in California goes out of state. Now, you might say, well, geez, there are more states that are out there that are legalizing marijuana. That's right. But I then have interviewed wardens from places like Colorado, and they said, there's more illegal grows here than before because people can now walk around and they can have recreational marijuana. How are you going to trace where they got it? They have to tell the truth if they bought it illegally. And so the illegal stuff sells for a slightly lower price without taxes. Okay, so that's what's happening. But the northern part of the state has a serious problem. And those fires, there have been 4 or 5 up there this summer. At least 1 or 2 of those were set up by growers. And, so they're out there. And these are big camps. I went in on one bust up there, and we found 36 sleeping bags. So this is not just 2 or 3 people. This was a colony, And what has happened is they're siphoning off so much water that the salmon and steelhead runs that used to come up the river aren't working. And so it's just causing a serious problem. And they're using the water that way so much that the downstream farmers are having trouble with getting enough water for irrigation for their crops as well. So it's spreading, and then people will move in and they have like, itinerant types will come in to trim marijuana. Okay, they're called trimigants. But then what do they do the rest of the year? Well, crime rates are just increasing in all those 3 counties. And it's a terrible problem. The thing that happens with the fires that you bring up, understand that we've had some drought in recent years, and that logging used to be one of the major sources of industry in that area. 2 things happened, one of which was the growers came in, and they're taking over the woods and shooting at people if they come near them. So, a friend of mine up there started a private security company to protect loggers. And then they ran into the opposition against logging. From 1990, the summer of Redwood Summer. Yeah, Redwood Summer, where there are all the protests. That stuff still goes on. The reality is that the forests that are there are subject to insects and diseases. Now, normally in the old days, if a tree was that way, you'd cut it down as quickly as possible. If that kind of logging is stopped or suspended, you start to increase more and more insects and diseases. And at the same time that the undergrowth is changed. And so what then happens, you've got all these dead trees, and along comes some kind of source, whether it's lightning, whether it's like the last thing up in Paradise, where and that's just tragic. I just talked to a friend yesterday. He's just dumbfounded who lived up there. They've got 81 people who have died so far from that. And there's another seven or 800 people that are missing. I mean, it's just horrible. But what happens there is that if those trees had been logged selectively, the dead ones taken out, that would have never exploded the way it did. But they're all this dead wood, and dead wood grows like crazy. But what has also happened as a result of the woods kind of growing up is that deer up there, that area is called the Deer Factory of California for black-tailed deer. It is the place, there's more there than any other place in the world, or there was. But now the combination of all this debris is there. The undergrowth that deer eat, they don't chew on a redwood tree. You know, they want acorns, they want stuff they can browse on. The deer population there is probably half of what it was 20 years ago. And I've been working with a group up there now that they actually go in and try to cut and do controlled burns to restore the undergrowth for food for deer. You know, but it's the California is the epicenter for illegal marijuana grows, but it is spreading nationwide, you know, in terms of there are illegal sellers in 50 states, all 50 states. They're bringing stuff into Canada now with legalization. And, you know, I mean, one could step back and say, well, it's like bootlegging. Well, maybe it is. But the one thing to note here is that the growers who are illegally use smuggled in illegal pesticides and fertilizers. So the stuff that you're getting has poison in it, you know? And I mean, that's the reality. But, you know, it sets up a whole climate anyways with this kind of stuff happening. And that's what I've been working on recently, is trying to get a handle on just how widespread this stuff is. And, you know, what we've been talking about, Ryan, let me just say, well, he's exaggerating. Okay. Right now, if you go online and you type in preventing crime in our national forests and grasslands, what you're going to come up with is a U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service brochure. And by the way, the Forest Service has been very supportive of me. The number of rangers that they have, or LEOs, or law enforcement officers, is about half what it used to be. It's just awful. But they're now handing out these brochures to people. You can get them online or in person. And what it does is, you know, it says, you should be safe and have a wonderful time when you're out in the national forests and grasslands. Unfortunately, crimes against persons and property do occur. They then go on to talk about how to protect your children. Let me read you what they say for preventing personal assault. While in the forest, most of us relax and leave our worries at home. Unfortunately, criminals may use the fact that you are relaxed against you to protect yourself. Be alert and aware of your surroundings and other people in your area. Stand tall and walk confidently. Don't allow fear to show. Trust your instincts. If you feel uncomfortable in a place, get out of there and get help. Be observant of others. Avoid confrontations. Be respectful of fellow outdoor enthusiasts and use good manners. But carry a cell phone just in case. Know how to contact law enforcement. Carry a noisemaker or a whistle or other protective devices. Do not pick up hitchhikers. Never go anywhere alone. Okay? I mean, I'd add to that, bring some pepper spray, use a walking stick or a ski pole, you know, and then you get into the thing about guns. Well, look, if you're going to get a gun and take it along, for God's sake, take a class and know how to use it.
Absolutely. That is one of the huge things too, because I mean, like you said, with all these people that they're just always armed, and it just seems like you showed me before we did this podcast, you emailed me and you showed me a video, and these guys, I mean, it was almost like they're in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're in full body armor. They're all locked and loaded to go. They're in helicopters. I mean, it looks like a war movie out there. And then you realize, no, this is happening in our country. But why do you think mainly that this isn't getting the coverage that it needs? Because, I mean, if this should be like a national news story. This should be on like every news channel. People should be talking about this. Why do you think it's not getting that sort of coverage?
I think part of it is that the news media are based in cities. Mm-hmm. What used to happen, and when I was growing up back in Michigan, every Thursday night, there was this television show that came on. It was one of the most popular in Detroit, and it was called Michigan Outdoors. And it would give you the read on what's going on, where to catch the fish, how things are going. And it was extremely popular. Those have all gone. Major newspapers have cut outdoor pages and columns out. There's very few of that anymore. You have to look online or go through groups.
We still have them in Minnesota. That's like one of the few ones that I know remaining. Where like every week they have them in the back, and then we still have like the Great Outdoors where we have people go out and do that. But that's just because Minnesota is such a huge fishing place. I mean, the land of 10,000 lakes. But yeah, other national.
That's right.
Places, I mean, we'll go and like me and my family will go and travel, and we have realized, that hunting and fishing, especially the promotion part of it, has dramatically gone down over time. Absolutely.
Yeah. And look, if you look for television shows or feature films that are aimed at mainstream audiences, very few of those deal with outdoor recreation sports. Mm-hmm. If you want to find that on television, you go to the Outdoor Channel, the Sportsman's Channel. Okay, now those shows are maybe fine, but the reality is they're not reaching those big audiences. I mean, when we did, again, Wild Justice, and this was on National Geographic, we were looking at between 2.5 and 3.5 million people that would see every show when it came out, and they're still airing on television now. So if we could get people into, and well, here's the other thing, that you bring this up in Minnesota. Okay. There have been four feature films in the last year or so that had people hunting in them. Okay. And they're all father and son movies.
Yep.
The first one, The Wilder People, Hunting for the Wilder People in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that did very well at the box office, and it had a father and son combination there. It was humorous and there was a lot of heart in it, and they tried to hide in the woods and all kinds of things. But at one point, the son wounds his father, shoots him. Now, it wasn't a bad wound, but it happened. But that movie did well. There's another one called Walking Out. Good acting and everything, but father and son, they're separated. Father is divorced, and so the kid comes to join with the father. They go out into the woods of Montana, and the father wants to take him hunting, and they're after a moose, and they get up there and find the moose is dead, that somebody's poached it. Okay, and then when they're trying to, deal with what else is happening, suddenly a bear attacks them. Father gets the boy up into a tree, hands him his gun, and the kid's gun goes off and wounds the father. Okay? Mm-hmm. So there's two movies that right there about son shoots father. Mm-hmm. Third one. And then the kid tries to drag his father out to save his life. All right. I won't tell you exactly what happened. You can watch the movie for it. But then there's another one about the legacy of the white-tailed deer hunter that was shot, about a father who has an outdoor TV show, hunting show. Mm-hmm. And he convinces his son, he's divorced from his mother. Son comes out with him, and he wants to teach his son to hunt. And they go out into the woods, and it's actually for a TV show. And they get out there, and the videographer's with them and whatever. And the kid just, is having trouble shooting a deer. And finally, they come upon this 14-point buck, which is huge, and the father is screaming, "Shoot, shoot, shoot!" And he finally pulls the trigger, and what does he do? He wounds the videographer. So the rest of the movie is about trying to get the videographer out and prevent him from bleeding to death.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's three. The other one, there is one other movie called Alpha, where father and son are out. This is Paleolithic times, and father and son are out, and they are chasing buffalo, and the boy falls down a hill, and they can't get him, and so they just assume he's dead, but the kid's still alive, and so he survives and has a wolf for a pet, and he does hunt, and survive that way. Okay, so that's a positive one. So that's 1 out of 4.
Yeah.
But it's like, if that is the kind of movie that's out there, and most people don't have contact with hunting and fishing firsthand,
Yep.
the media are not carrying those stories anymore. I mean, you have Sports at Field and Field and Stream and Outdoor Life, and they're the outdoor TV shows, but those are aimed not at mainstream audiences, but at people in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the numbers are declining.
Mm-hmm.
In California, the number of hunters and fishermen that were there 20 years ago are half today of what they were then, even though the population is, grown considerably. And, it's a national problem.
Yeah. I love to bring up the story. My dad always tells me this, just about how different things were back when he was going to school in like the late 70s, especially for Minnesota where it was now. He grew up in a small town of like 1,100 people. And when his high school, the funny story is that kids would show up, they would have their shotguns and rifles in their trunks of their cars, and they would park in the school parking lot, and then they'd just leave their cars out there with their guns and everything in them, and then they'd just wait to go hunting afterwards. I mean, that would never happen today, but it just really just shows, how much the hunting culture has changed. I mean, there still are so much. I mean, I like I said, I'm very biased because I'm in Minnesota, where hunting is still a very huge part of life, but it's one of the few last remaining states, I think, where hunting is just a lot, because I mean, hunting season is still almost like a national holiday in parts here, where people just take the week off of work usually, and then they just go out and hunt. But it's one of the last times, or last places, I'd say, that people still really cherish that. But just to sort of clarify, when you're saying wildlands, what exactly do you mean for some of the audience members that might not know? Is it the protected land, or is it just like naturally forested lands that no one lives in? What is that? What exactly does the wildland mean?
There's sort of 3 different types here. A wildlands means that it goes all the way from wilderness to sort of slightly inhabited. And in this case, what we're talking about are the federal lands like Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM. Okay. But then there are state versions of those things. Oh, and the Park Service. Okay. And then there are state versions of parks and forests and refuges. But then you will also have local and regional ones. And it's where no or very few people are found. But the movement of people is strongest in what we're calling the wildlife urban interface. In other words, into communities that are set up so that where people are living close to nature. And unfortunately, this thing in Paradise, in California, is a good example. I mean, here's a retirement community, basically. Mm-hmm. They're living out there, and they're 27,000 people or something like that, and all surrounded by national forests. Okay, so that's wildlands interface. The same for the Emerald Triangle, in Northern California. And again, what's happening is that the price of living in big cities, especially in California, is increasing. Yep. And where you'd start to see this stuff, I can remember, when I'm taking time off, when we were shooting Wild Justice, I used to hike in the Point Reyes area, the National Seashore area. And there was a lot of wildland there. And one day, I decided I would explore a little bit more off the beaten path. And I came upon these 2 like teepees out there, all made out of wood. And I thought, well, is kids doing this? I mean, when we were kids, we might have built something like that, but it looked too elaborate. And I talked then back to the park rangers, and they said, oh, hell, we had to chase them out. They're kids who are living out there. They're homeless. And what has happened is that kind of thing, there's a tremendous problem, especially in California, but nationwide, with homeless people. And, people thinking them out in the streets or whatever. Well, the reality is a number of them are actually living in the woods. Mm-hmm. Okay. And when they're out there, if they want to make a little money and you haven't got work, why not get a few seeds and plant some marijuana?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so that's the kind of, or meth lab. Meth labs are big too. That's the sort of stuff that's going on to escape what is going on. Now, again, we've got national news media that's 10 to 17 times more negative than it is positive and objective.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
people are being fed on what is happening, and what they're being fed on is, and this creates an interesting situation, because when you've got that kind of focus, I've been going through recently and just clipping headlines of what's going on. And if you look for hunting in general, in just mainstream stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it's either somebody's been killed or seriously wounded, or they've shot something and people are opposing them.
Yes.
All
Okay,
right?
so I have a quick tangent with that though, because if you remember when that lion got killed in Africa a couple of years back, so the guy that shot him lives in the town right next to me where I live, and his office and his dentist office is 2 blocks away from where I'm talking to you right now, where I live. So we remember, I mean, there was protests there. I couldn't even drive. Like, I stayed indoors. I had to take the day off of my job because just the traffic there, where there was thousands of people outside this little office of his. And it was that was just a hassle. So that was my personal connection to that. And I mean, I still go on bike rides all the time by where that guy's house is. I mean, it's quieted down where most people don't, bother him at all. But it's just one of those things where that has really affected me. And that, like you said, that's absolutely true with those hunting stories. It's either someone gets really, really hurt, like you hear like a guy gets mauled by a bear, or it's like, someone kills a prize lion or an elephant or something like that in Africa, and then everyone just talks about how bad hunting is then because of that.
Yeah, and the problem here is that actually, and they'll say, well, the population of like animals, big game animals in Africa is going down. Well, reality is that it's going down from poaching more than anything else. Bushmeat, ivory tusks and teeth and skins, and those guys don't care about anything.
Yep.
And so, except getting something to make money. So the reality is that, you've got a serious problem that's developed about the lack of communicating to people about what are the realities that are going on. And there's a lot of stuff that is not backed in good wildlife management. Okay. And the consequence of which is that things get distorted. Now, the thing I wanted to just mention on what's happening with on one hand, we talked about how fishing and hunting have been declining. And at the same time, there are like 12.7 million more homes and 25 million people, living in those areas. I looked up popularity of national parks, and it's going off the charts right now. In 1940, 25 million people visited national parks. In 1970, it was 170. Last year, 330.9 million people visited national parks. But what are they doing when they get there? 99% never go more than 50 feet off the road. And they spend 6 hours there, including time spent in the restroom and in getting a bite to eat. So we need to get more people out. I mean, it is for their health and well-being, as well as appreciation for the importance.
Absolutely.
But I mean, but the reality is that national parks are being crowded, and people don't really, go off the road. They're going to climb out of their car and take a picture and get in and drive along. Well, that's not spending time. Is better than nothing, but it's not understanding what is our natural connection to
Yes.
nature and to the world.
100%. I mean, I have so many people that come on here that we have a lot of people that come on and talk about mental health too, where it comes to like anxiety, stress. And I think a lot
Yes.
of that tends to seem from the world that we live in right now is such a computerized world, so much technology. I mean, as we're talking through Skype on a podcast,
Sure.
but like all these people with texting, all of the extra added stress that technology brings, that a lot of people just need that release. And a lot of people, that's why you do think I see a lot more people. I mean, even though they aren't spending so much time in national parks or they're not stepping out of the car, they do like to sort of drive around those areas because it does sort of give them more of that connection of where we were, thousands of years ago,
Right.
and where we evolved from, and just because let's face it, we are a social species that isn't meant to, be texting each other on the phone. We're meant to have like face-to-face conversations, and we're meant to
Yeah.
be outside and enjoy the fresh air, not to be bottled up in some office for 50 hours a week. I mean, it's one of those things too, where I think that as we get more and more ingrained in this technology, the more we sort of want to go back to sort of that more, sort of the more quote unquote simpler lifestyle, where it was just, being outdoors and just enjoying those type of comforts. So I do think that is a big reason for that increase in visitors. But like you said, yeah, people actually need to get out there and start engaging more in it, though.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And one of the projects I'm working on now is a high school in Petaluma, California, who has they're based along a small river that used to have a salmon run. And one of the biology teachers a few years ago took his class out and said, "Look at this thing. There used to be salmon here, and now there's junk." Well, the kids got all up excited about it, and they pulled 25 truckloads of trash out of there. A few salmon started coming up. So they thought, well, but the stream was nowhere as long as it used to be. So what they started doing is they built initially a small fish hatchery, and then that it didn't pass the earthquake standards. So they raised $500,000 and built a state-of-the-art fish hatchery, and they now raise 20,000 salmon a year. I mean, I'm trying to find anybody out there who runs with a foundation or whatever. I'm trying to get funding because I can get it on PBS.
Yeah.
But it's been hard.
Yeah.
It's been difficult. I mean, to find support for that sort of thing. But I'd love to see this become like a national movement. I mean, if you're going to school, whether it's high school or college, the best learning about the environment is hands-on stuff.
Absolutely.
And these kids are out there wading around in waders and they're catching salmon. They're good enough at it that they actually have been retained by the Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA to help do research on stuff and to restore another stream because of what they've done. And I'd love to see high schools all across the country doing stuff like that.
Absolutely. It's definitely one of those things. But you mentioned an interesting topic. You said you were talking about earthquakes, and that got me to thinking, what role do these game wardens have when it comes to earthquakes? Because when you think about some of these earthquakes, I mean, you're going to have a lot of like trees fall down. You're going to have a lot of damage sometimes to the landscape. Yeah. What part of their job does it entail for earthquakes? Do they have any training for that? Like how to recover things, or what? Do they have anything in that specific area?
Yeah, they're trained better than just about any other law enforcement officer to deal with situations in wild places. And I mean, they're all driving trucks with four-wheel drive, and they're definitely trained to do that work as first responders. But there's not enough of them to be able to do the stuff that's really needed.
Because like you were talking about, I mean, like you said, you got it up to like 360 or whatever the number was for wardens. But still, if you think about it, that's one per every 100,000 people in California. So that's right. I mean, it's so great that you almost doubled it. But I mean, it's like they still have so much more work to do. I mean, what do you think are some other situations? I mean, what do you think are some other ways that this could be improved other than getting more game wardens? You think, like you said, the public needs to be a lot more aware of what's going on. But what are some other solutions you think that would also help out, sort of, I mean, help ease this situation? Because with the growing, I mean, it's not one of those things that like really you can just like wipe it off clean. It's got to be like an eventual thing where little things I think add up to it.
Well, there are two things here. First of all, something that has been developed up in the Emerald Triangle, and this is a friend of mine and a group of people who were retired military people or retired police officers have formed an organization called Lear Assets Management, and it's a private security company, but their focus is on wildlands. And so they are now out doing stuff associated with first responders, with game wardens. They work right with the game wardens, and they've been trained by federal and state agencies and everything. I mean, they're very, very strong, legitimate people. And actually, they're strong enough so that they are actually now training state parks rangers on how to deal with trespass grows.
Oh, wow.
And so, I mean, because if you combine that training along with their previous training that they got in the military, or as police officers, they're better trained than a lot of people. The second thing is, I think we have to really work at developing, each community should develop a volunteer support organization. I know when I was living in California, where I lived, we had this unit. We were first responders, and we trained with the fire department and police department. And when if something happened, like either a fire or an earthquake, we were given specific jobs of directing traffic, and running radio communications and stuff like that. And we learned how to respond to, like, if a vehicle goes off the road and is turned over, what do you do? Some initial first aid stuff. I mean, we need to do that, I think, as a national movement to get people involved in their community. It reduces conflict with police on one hand that sometimes happen. People understand each other better, but it also builds community and builds support,
Yeah.
I mean,
100%.
We should have that.
I mean, like that sense of community really has, and it's another thing that I can bring back to the technology. We're so connected to our phones that we're not really connecting with our neighbors as much as we should. The sense of community that I felt, when I was younger, like 20 years ago, I could really, people were a lot more connected. So it's definitely, like you said, one of those things that we definitely need to bring back. You were talking, about how Wild Justice has sort of inspired a TV series that's going to be shot in the spring. Do you know where people could watch that show? Is it going to be on the Geographic Channel as well?
No, it'll be something. It's either Netflix or Hulu, and it's going to be called Lone Pine.
Okay.
And I can't say any more right now on it. Okay. It's just, but my name will appear as, inspired by.
That's
but,
so awesome.
it'll be, but it will take people right out into the woods on patrol with the wardens and show exactly what they're doing on those things. And that's what, now, I there's some big names that are involved in this, but I can't, until they've all signed on the dotted line, I can't say anything yet.
Oh, yeah, that's totally awesome. So are you currently working on anything else now at this time, or are you just sort of relaxing?
I have two things I am working on this documentary about the high school in Petaluma, California. I have another project, a couple of books. Looking at, that I have right now that are related with game wardens as heroes in them. If there are any publishers out there, please contact me. But then I have a feature film that I've just started working on, and it's still in the very early stages. It's about the life of Aldo Leopold, the conservationist from Wisconsin, if you're familiar with them. But that's in the very early stages.
That's unbelievable. So what is your best recommendation for people that, listen to this and they really get inspired to, look more into the topic? We'll leave all the links down below. We'll leave the link for your book that you helped write, and then we'll leave the link for your TV show, because people really need to start and go and watch this stuff. But what are some other ways that you think community-wise, where should they go if they really wanted to get involved and help out with this?
I would tell them, most people have never had contact with a game warden. I would tell you to go and make contact with them. Tell them about, that you're really interested and wonder. And there are two things here, one of which, believe me, if you've ever done a ride along, and they do this with people, as long as you seem to be ethical and whatever. Yeah. I know in California they do, and they do in New Mexico and Colorado, because I've worked with the game wardens in all three states. But so that's one thing. I would suggest, trying to get a game warden if you've got a class, come in and talk to them. If you go to my website, uh, on www.jamesswan.com
Mm-hmm.
and look under Snow Goose Productions and Projects, you will find that our documentary that we did about the game wardens in California is there. You just scroll down, Endangered Species, California Fish and Game Wardens. That's 66 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see that for nothing, and
Yeah.
it's right there.
Absolutely.
Beyond that, I think that, again, volunteer. If you get involved with people, volunteer to help with these people. They're all understaffed, whether it's Forest Service, BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service or state game wardens. They are all understaffed these days. I was trying to get statistics on everything there. I know the Forest Service, when I started getting into this stuff, and I am working on a book on all what we've been talking about too. But they want to know, who are you? Why are you contacting me, or whatever? What are you going to write about? And so, after I told them about wild justice and everything, they said, "Oh." Suddenly, I get this package, and they sent me, under the Freedom of Information Act, over 600 cases.
Wow.
And they just said, look, we got a real problem of a shortage of officers. We're being cut back on that. And I checked with the National Park Service. Right now, they have a shortfall of $11 billion to be used for roads, trails, and buildings.
Wow.
Okay. I mean, if you might have a chat with your local representative or senator about this kind of thing, because, what happens is, if the woods and wildlands are turned into places where crime increases, it has all kinds of ripple effects. And it decreases the opportunity to enjoy and appreciate and nature and its benefits of just being out in natural areas, whether you hunt or fish or not. Okay. And secondly, it starts to set up situations like what happened with California and all those fires. Okay. Then everyone who buys a license to hunt and fish contributes to the amount of money that comes in to run those fish and game for each state. Mm-hmm. And, and the more that, and what has been happening, like in California, I mean, the licenses to go hunting there, you're going to spend $100, for God's sakes, to go out hunting. Now that in itself is going to cut back, and they've gone from, in the last 20 years, it's been from like 650,000 hunters down to 250,000.
Wow.
And so there are half as many fishermen. There were, in 1980, there were 2.5 million fishermen in California. Now it's 1.2 million.
That's
and so, as you can imagine, the Fish and Wildlife Agency now is really hurting. That's one of the reasons why they had so few game wardens, is because they're trying to, run all these programs and everything. And so, again, if volunteer, help the folks out, participate.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, before we wrap things up here, is there any one specific message that you think that we haven't covered yet that you would really like to get out to the people, just to sort of bring awareness?
Well, I would say that, from what I understand, the average person today spends about 7 hours a day looking at an electronic screen. Mm-hmm. Do an electronic screen fast.
Yeah.
Literally once a week. Just don't look at it, or just cut back, in half, and just spend time outdoors. And one of my books, and you can get it from Amazon, is called Nature as Teacher and Healer. Mm-hmm. And it's literally about the psychology of the importance of making contact with nature. Mm-hmm. So that to me would be my advice. Get out there and enjoy it.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. And again, James, we cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. I mean, you really brought such a great issue to this show. And I mean, we're so grateful. And everyone out there, I mean, if you're really interested in this, go look him up. We'll leave all of his links down below. We'll leave a link to all of his books. We'll leave a link to all the shows that he's done. I mean, we highly, highly, highly recommend you go and check it out. It is a topic that really, really, a lot more people need to be invested in. And James, we cannot thank you enough for, doing that research and getting into it and really bringing that awareness. I mean, you've helped bring so much more stuff when it comes to more game wardens and much more awareness. So honestly, just keep doing what you're doing, and it's such an inspiration having you on. It was so great, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, you guys go and find James on all the links down below. Really appreciate him coming on. And this is Ryan Johnson, DD on the spot, signing out. Have a great day, everyone.